The forest was not quiet that morning. It never was. But this was a different kind of sound. Not the distant crump of artillery or the nervous chatter of sparrows. This was the grinding of steel gears, the guttural growl of a Maybach engine filtering through the dense Ardennes pine. It was a sound that froze the blood. A Panzer. Inside the American Sherman, the world shrunk to the dimensions of a steel coffin. The air was thick with the smell of cold sweat, cordite, and fear. Private First Class Arthur Kline, 19 years old from Boise, Idaho, heard it too. His hands, slick on the brass casing of a 75mm shell, faltered for a second. "He's lining up," the gunner, Corporal Miller, whispered, his eye pressed to the telescopic sight. His voice was a dry rasp. "Hull down behind the ridge. Tiger. Maybe 200 yards. The commander, Lieutenant Hayes, swore softly. "Loader. God damn it, Kline, get around in the tube. Now." But Artie didn't move with the frantic, practiced speed they'd all been drilled on. Instead of grabbing the high-explosive round ready in the first rack, he turned. He pivoted away from the logical choice, away from the standard doctrine beaten into them at Fort Knox. He reached deeper into the shadowy recesses of the sponson rack, his fingers finding not the familiar olive drab of an he shell, but the sharper, more sinister contour of an armor-piercing round. And he did something that made Miller's blood run cold. He loaded it backwards. "What in God's name are you doing, Kline?" Miller hissed, not daring to take his eye from the sight. "You're loading it ass backwards. Hayes, he's lost his mind." Artie didn't answer. He just rammed the shell home, the base facing the breech, the pointed tip aimed down the bore. The breech block slammed shut with a definitive, metallic clang that sounded like a death knell. It was the sound of a court-martial. Or a suicide. Outside, the Tigers' long 88mm gun began to traverse, seeking them out. Lieutenant Hayes opened his mouth to scream an order, to countermand this insanity. But it was too late. Miller, his knuckles white on the trigger, his mind screaming that this was all wrong, that this kid had just doomed them all, had no choice. He had a shot. He took it. The Sherman roared, bucking on its suspension. The world dissolved into sound and fury. For a heartbeat, there was only the ringing in their ears and the certain, grim expectation of the Tigers' return fire, a fire that would turn their 33 tons of steel into a molten grave. But the return fire never came. Through his periscope, Hayes saw it. A flash, not on their hull, but on the Tigers. A jet of orange flame, not from the muzzle, but from the German tank's own ammunition rack, erupting through a perfectly punched, smoldering hole in its glassy plate. The Tiger didn't just brew up. It came apart like a toy under a sledgehammer. Silence, deeper than before, filled the Sherman. Artie Kline, his hands now steady, was already reaching for another round, his movements calm, methodical, and utterly, terrifyingly deliberate. He was still loading them backwards. The silence inside the Sherman after the Tigers' cataclysmic demise was a physical thing. It pressed in on them, heavier than the steel walls, thicker than the smoke now coiling into the frozen Ardennes air. The only sound was the faint tink-tink-tink of their own hot metal cooling, a counter-rhythm to the ragged, disbelieving breaths of four men who had just cheated a very specific, very violent death. Lieutenant Hayes slowly lowered his periscope. He could still see the afterimage of the explosion burned onto his retina, the Tiger's turret, a 50-ton blacksmith's anvil, lifted clean off its race and tossed into the pines like a child's discarded toy. He turned, his movements stiff, and looked down into the fighting compartment. His gaze bypassed the gunner, Miller, who was still frozen at his sight, mouth agape. It landed on Artie Kline. Artie wasn't looking at him. He was already wiping the carbon off the breech block with a rag, his motions calm, practiced, almost domestic in their normality. As if he hadn't just rewritten the entire book of tank warfare in the 6 seconds it took for a shell to cross a snow-dusted clearing. "Kline," Hayes said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its command authority. It was just a man's voice, confused and afraid. What did you do? Before Artie could answer, the world outside intruded again. Not the grinding of a panzer, but the sharp, frantic crack of a Panzerfaust hitting a tree to their left. The German infantry were still out there, disoriented but dangerous. The war had only paused for their little miracle. Later, Hayes barked, the officer in him reasserting control. Driver, reverse. Miller, coax on those tree lines. Kline, keep them coming. The Sherman lurched backwards, its engine whining in protest. Inside, the choreography of survival began again. But the rhythm was broken. Miller, traversing the turret, firing bursts of .30 caliber into the shadows, couldn't shake the image from his mind. The backwards shell. The impossible result. He risked a glance at Kline. The kid was loading another round. And it was still backwards. The pointed tip of the armor-piercing ballistic capped round, the business end designed to punch through German plate, was pointed toward them, toward the breach. It was an affront to logic. A heresy. He's a witch, Miller thought, his knuckles white on the trigger grips. Or he's just damn lucky. But luck didn't look like that. Luck was screaming and praying. Artie Kline was just, working. His face, lit by the dim red battle lamp, was a mask of concentration, yes, but also of a profound, unsettling certainty. The memory came to Artie not as a clear picture, but as a sensation, the dry, chalky dust of a classroom at Fort Knox, Kentucky, months ago. The air thick with heat and the droning voice of a ballistics instructor, a career Army man who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The M61 APCBC round, the instructor had drawled, tapping a diagram with a pointer. Note the streamlined ballistic cap for better flight characteristics. Behind it, the armor-piercing cap to defeat face-hardened plate. The shell body contains the payload, a small explosive charge and a base fuse. Upon penetration, the fuse detonates, showering the enemy crew compartment with steel splinters and blast. It is a sophisticated piece of engineering. You will load it as designed. Artie, you will not fresh-faced recruit with a mind that chewed on problems like a dog on a bone, had raised his hand. Sir, he'd asked, if the fuse is in the base, it needs the impact of the armor to crush and activate it, right? The instructor had sighed, a man weary of questions from boys who thought they knew better. That is correct, soldier. The deceleration force arms the fuse. So, Artie had pressed, if you were up against something with thicker armor than the shell was rated for, something it might not fully penetrate, would loading it backwards, so the base fuse hits the plate first, would that initiate the explosion on the armor, instead of behind it? Like a high-explosive squash head. The classroom had erupted in snickers. A few guys behind him had mocked his high-pitched voice. Backwards Kline, someone had muttered, and the name had stuck through basic. The instructor's face had turned stony. Private, the Wehrmacht does not load its shells backwards. The United States Army does not load its shells backwards. You will load it as per the manual. Is that understood? Your foolishness will get men killed. The lesson had ended. The laughter had faded. But the idea had never left Artie. It had festered in the quiet corners of his mind, a ghost of a theory waiting for its moment in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Now, in the clanging, smoky reality of the tank, the theory was flesh. The first Tiger was proof. But the war wasn't done testing him. Contact. Front. 2 o'clock. Panther. Miller's voice was a shriek of renewed terror. Hayes saw it. Another shape, lower and sleeker than the Tiger, but just as deadly. It was maneuvering around the burning hulk of its comrade, its long 75mm gun searching for the source of the kill. They were exposed, reversing too slowly. Gun target. Panther. Load he. Hayes commanded, instinct taking over. He wanted to blast the ground in front of it, create cover, maybe track it. It was the textbook response. Artie heard the order. He had an he shell in his hand. He looked at it. Then he looked at the rack of AP rounds. The Panther's frontal glacis was sloped, a devilish design that caused shells to ricochet. A standard AP hit might just glance away into the trees. His way, his backwards way, it might work. It had to work. He made his choice. He dropped the he shell. It clattered on the floor plates. He grabbed another AP round. And again, he loaded it backwards. Kline, no. Hayes roared. The breech slammed shut. Miller, his body trembling with a cocktail of adrenaline and sheer disbelief, saw the Panther's gun stop its traverse. It was on them. He had no time. No choice. He screamed, a raw, wordless sound of fury and fear, and pulled the trigger. The gun roared. Time seemed to stretch, to become elastic. Artie watched the tracer, a tiny, doomed star, fly across the clearing. He saw it strike the Panther's sloped front plate, right where the driver's port was. It didn't ricochet. It didn't shatter. It seemed to stick for a microsecond, a starfish on a windowpane. Then, a flash. Not a penetration, but an eruption. The entire section of armor plate bulged inward, then vomited a plume of fire and molten metal outwards. The Panther shuddered to a halt, its engine dying instantly. A deep, internal secondary explosion rumbled, and then its ammunition began to cook off, popping and cracking inside its steel tomb. 2. In as many minutes. The forest fell silent again, this time with a new, deeper respect. The German infantry fire had ceased. It was as if the enemy itself was pausing, trying to comprehend the unnatural force they were facing. Inside the Sherman, nobody spoke. Miller slowly released his grip on the trigger, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The driver, Private Costanza, whispered a Hail Mary into his intercom. Hayes stared at Artie. The ridicule, the mockery, the court-martial he'd been mentally preparing, it all evaporated, replaced by a cold, staggering awe. This wasn't luck. This wasn't insanity. This was something else. This was a terrible, brutal new kind of genius, born not in a laboratory, but in the desperation of a steel box facing death. He keyed his intercom, his voice low and steady. Kline. Artie looked up, finally meeting his commander's gaze. His eyes were not those of a triumphant warrior. They were the eyes of a young man who had seen a terrible secret of the universe and been forced to use it. Sir. You see any more of them, Hayes said, the words feeling both heavy and right in his mouth, you keep loading them just like that. He looked out the vision slit. The clearing was now guarded by 2 burning German wrecks, funeral pyres for their crews and for the old way of doing things. The snow around them was stained black with oil and soot. The world had shifted on its axis. And in the frozen heart of the Battle of the Bulge, in the belly of a machine deemed inferior and obsolete, a new doctrine was being written, one backward shell at a time. The silence that followed was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the sound of a paradigm shattering. The 2 burning tanks became beacons in the twilight. Their pyres cast long, dancing shadows through the pines, painting the snow in hues of orange and black. Inside the Sherman, now nestled in a deeper hold-down position behind a fold in the earth, the initial shock had curdled into a brittle, electric tension. They were no longer just a crew in a tank. They were custodians of a secret. A dangerous, heretical secret. Private Costanza, the driver, finally broke the silence on the intercom. My grandma's rosary beads are warm, he muttered, his Brooklyn accent thick with awe. I swear to God, they're burning a hole in my chest. It's a miracle. Corporal Miller, wiping sweat from his brow with a greasy sleeve, snorted. It was a harsh, ugly sound. Miracle? That wasn't a miracle, Costanza. That was. I don't know what that was. But it wasn't divine. It was wrong. He glared at Artie, who was methodically checking the remaining AP rounds, his fingers tracing the inverted contours as if reading Braille. "You saw what it did. It didn't punch a hole. It liquefied the front of that Panther. What's that do to the men inside? It's not clean. It's not right. The men inside." The words hung in the air, thick as the smoke. They had all been trained to think of enemy tanks as steel targets, abstract threats. But Miller's words made them remember the humanity crammed into those other steel boxes, boys their own age, hearing the same terrifying grind of gears, feeling the same cold fear. Artie's method didn't just kill a tank. It annihilated it. And everyone in it. Lieutenant Hayes felt the moral weight settle on his shoulders. He was the officer. He had sanctioned this. "It's them or us, Miller," he said, his voice low but firm. "Their 88 would have done the same to us. There are no clean kills in this war. But there are rules." Miller insisted, his voice rising. "There's a way things are done. We're not savages. We follow the manual. We fight with honor." Artie stopped what he was doing. He didn't look up. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost absorbed by the hum of the electrical systems. "The manual was written for a war that doesn't exist anymore, Miller. The manual gets you killed by a Tiger." The truth of it was a physical blow. The manual had gotten thousands of Shermans and their crews killed. They were called Ronsons for a reason. One hit, and they lit up first time, every time. Honor didn't mean much when you were burning alive. A sudden crackle on the battalion radio net saved Hayes from having to reply. It was the voice of Captain Riggs, their company commander, static cutting through his transmission. "Kingfish 1, this Kingfish actual. Sitrep. We're hearing a lot of noise from your sector. Over." Hayes keyed the handset, his mind racing. How to explain this? "Sir, we engaged 2 heavy enemy armor elements and destroyed them using an unorthodox loading method that defies standard ballistic principles. They'd think he'd cracked under the strain." "Kingfish actual, this is Kingfish 1, Hayes said, choosing his words with the care of a man crossing a minefield. "Engaged and destroyed 1 Mark 6 Tiger and 1 Mark V Panther. Sector is, temporarily clear. Over." The silence from the other end was longer than the static could account for. "Say again, Kingfish 1. You knocked out a Tiger and a Panther." "Confirm." "Over." "Confirmed, actual. 1 Tiger, 1 Panther." "Over." "How? Did Baker Company flank them?" "Over." Hayes took a breath. He looked at Artie, then at the horrified face of Miller. He made a decision. "Negative, actual. We engaged them frontally." "Over." Another long pause. They could almost hear the disbelief on the other end. "Frontally. With a 75. Roger, Kingfish 1. Hold your position. We're consolidating the line. Out." The radio fell silent. The unspoken question hung in the ether, how? "They'll find out," Miller thought, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "And when they do, they'll court-martial us all. Kline for witchcraft, Hayes for permitting it, and me for pulling the trigger." The night wore on, a long, cold vigil punctuated by the distant sounds of battle echoing from other parts of the forest. The flames of the German tanks died down to sullen glows, their fuel spent. Inside the Sherman, the crew took turns on watch, but nobody slept. The event had rewired them. Costanza saw every shadow as a potential target for their new, terrible power. Miller jumped at every sound, expecting the MPs to come and drag them away. Hayes stared into the darkness, wrestling with the command decision that could either save his crew or damn his back against the cold steel. He wasn't thinking about courts-martial or morality. He was thinking about physics. The instructor at Fort Knox had been wrong. The backwards shell wasn't about penetration. It was about energy transfer. A standard AP round was a spear, designed to pierce and then explode inside. His way was a sledgehammer. By hitting the plate base first, the entire kinetic energy of the shell was dissipated almost instantly into the armor itself, creating spalling, a hurricane of red-hot steel shards, on the inside. It didn't need to penetrate. It just needed to hit. And the massive, flat surface of the shell's base was a perfect anvil for the hammer blow of the gun's propellant. It was so simple. So brutally, elegantly simple. Why hadn't anyone else thought of it? Because they were too busy following the manual, a voice in his head answered. Because they were too afraid to be laughed at. Dawn broke, a pale, grudging light that did little to warm the frozen forest. The snow began to fall again, soft and silent, laying a gentle shroud over the horrors of the previous day. It was then that they heard it. Not the sound of German engines, but the familiar, welcome rumble of American vehicles. A jeep, followed by 2 more Shermans from their company, crunched through the snow and pulled up beside their position. Captain Riggs himself was in the jeep, his face a mask of grim curiosity under his helmet. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the snow, and walked over to Hayes's cupola, his eyes scanning the 2 blackened, smoldering wrecks in the clearing. His breath plumed in the cold air. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, he whispered, staring at the Tiger. The hole in its front was unmistakable, a clean, circular puncture, but around it, the armor was grotesquely bulged inward, like tin foil struck by a cannonball. It was not the damage of a standard 75mm round. He turned to Hayes, his eyes narrow. "Lieutenant. Walk with me." Hayes climbed out of the tank, his body stiff and cold. The 2 officers walked a few paces away, their backs to the crew. "I've had reports from the other side of the ridge," Riggs said quietly, his voice low and intense. "A listening post intercepted German traffic last night. They're talking about a new American weapon. Some kind of shrapnel cannon. They think we've deployed a secret, high-velocity gun in the sector. They're rerouting a whole assault group because of it." Hayes said nothing. He just stared at the frozen ground. "Now," Riggs continued, stopping and turning to face him. "I know for a fact you don't have a secret gun. You have a standard M4A3 with a 75mm M3. The same as every other tank in this godforsaken company. So I'm going to ask you once, Hayes. How did you do this?" Hayes met his captain's gaze. He could lie. He could claim a lucky shot to the ammunition rack. But Riggs was a good officer. He'd see right through it. And the evidence was there, in the warped steel of the German tanks. It was undeniable. "It was my loader, sir," Hayes said, his voice steady. "Private Kline. He modified the firing procedure." Riggs's eyebrows shot up. "Modified? What does that mean?" "He loads the AP rounds backwards, sir." The captain stared at him. For a full 10 seconds, he didn't speak. The only sound was the gentle fall of snow and the idling engine of the jeep. Hayes watched the emotions play across Riggs's face, confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and finally, a flicker of the same awe Hayes had felt inside the tank. "Backwards," Riggs repeated, the word a flat statement. He looked past Hayes, at the Sherman, at the young private who was now passing a shell up to Miller for inspection. "And it works. It works, sir. 2 for 2. Captain Riggs let out a long, slow breath. He looked at the terrified German infantry they'd taken prisoner the day before, huddled under a tarp by the jeep. He looked at the 2 destroyed behemoths that had, just hours ago, been the spearhead of the German advance. He thought about the intercepted German radio traffic, the confusion, the fear. He made a decision that would change the course of their war. "Get him," Riggs said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Get your loader and his crew. You're coming with me. We're taking a little trip to Battalion HQ." He turned, his eyes burning with a new, fierce light. And for God's sake, Hayes, tell him to bring a few of those backwards shells. The journey to Battalion HQ was a pilgrimage through a shattered world. Their Sherman, now an object of whispered curiosity and sidelong glances, followed Captain Riggs's jeep down roads churned to frozen mud by countless tracks. They passed columns of haggard, frost-bitten infantry, their faces gray with exhaustion. They passed burned-out half-tracks and the skeletal remains of farmhouses, their blackened timbers reaching for the sky like accusing fingers. Everywhere was the detritus of retreat and counterattack, a landscape of violent indecision. Inside the tank, the atmosphere was just as fractured. Miller had withdrawn into a stony silence, his gaze fixed on the back of Artie's head, a mixture of resentment and a terrifying, grudging dependency warring on his face. Costanza kept touching the rosary beads under his uniform, his lips moving in silent prayer. Only Artie seemed unchanged, his posture the same, his movements as methodical as ever. He was cleaning the breech mechanism with a wire brush, the scraping sound the only noise in the intercom silence. He was in his element, a problem solver who had found a solution, oblivious to the theological earthquake he had caused. Lieutenant Hayes watched the ruined world slide past his vision block. He felt like a man transporting a stolen atomic secret. The two blackened German wrecks they had left behind were not just kills, they were evidence of a paradigm shift. And he was taking the catalyst to the very heart of the machine. Battalion HQ was a chaotic symphony of organized panic, set up in the cavernous, cold cellar of a mostly intact chateau. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, cigarette smoke, and the sharp, acidic tang of radio electronics. Typewriters clacked incessantly beneath the low, vaulted stone ceilings, and harried staff officers moved maps around like chess pieces, their faces drawn under the harsh glow of bare bulbs. Colonel Reed, the battalion commander, was a man who looked like he had been carved from the same granite as the Ardennes themselves. He had a bulldog's jaw and eyes that had seen too many casualty reports. He listened to Captain Riggs's hushed, urgent explanation without a word, his gaze occasionally flicking to Artie, who stood at a nervous parade rest beside Hayes. When Riggs finished, the colonel let the silence hang. He picked up a nearby M61 APCBC round from an ammo crate, hefting its weight in his hands. He turned it over, his thumb running over the ballistic cap, he finally said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of profound disbelief. Yes, sir, Hayes said, his voice tighter than he wanted. We've confirmed it twice against heavy armor. The effect is catastrophic. Catastrophic for who, Lieutenant? Reed asked, his eyes boring into Hayes. For the Germans, or for the principles of ballistics we've staked this war on? He dropped the shell back into the crate with a heavy thud. I've had the initial after-action report from your sector. I've also had a preliminary intelligence summary based on German radio intercepts. They're calling it the Teufelskanone. He paused, letting the translation sink in. The Devil's Cannon. They think we've deployed a new, terrifyingly powerful anti-tank gun. It's causing confusion, forcing them to reconsider their local tactics. That confusion, that hesitation, is a weapon in itself. He walked over to a large situation map pinned to a board. The German spearheads were represented by sweeping red arrows. The entire point of this offensive is momentum. Hitler is betting everything on shock, on speed, on our collapse. Anything that slows that down, anything that introduces doubt into the mind of a panzer commander, is of incalculable value. He turned back to them, his decision made. We test it. Here. Now. The order sent a jolt through the entire HQ. Within minutes, a working party was hauling a spare, heavily damaged Panther hull into an adjacent field, its turret long gone, a rusting hulk destined for the scrapyard. A crowd began to gather, staff officers, radio operators, runners, their faces a mixture of skepticism and macabre curiosity. It was a bizarre spectacle, the entire nerve center of an infantry battalion pausing its war to watch a single private prove a theory. A towed 75mm anti-tank gun was positioned 100 yards from the Panther hull. The backwards shell was produced. An artillery sergeant, a veteran of North Africa and Italy, looked at the round being handed to him as if it were a live serpent. "Colonel, with all due respect, it's against every regulation," the sergeant protested. "Consider the regulations suspended for the duration of this experiment, Sergeant," Reed said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Load the gun." The sergeant looked at Artie, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. With a shake of his head and a muttered curse, the sergeant rammed the shell home, backwards. The breech clanged shut. The gun crew stood back. "Fire," Colonel Reed commanded. The crack of the 75mm was sharp and familiar in the cold air. The shell, a blur, crossed the short distance and struck the Panther's sloped front plate. The result was not the clean clang of a ricochet or the dull thud of a partial penetration. It was a different sound entirely, a deep, visceral crump, like a giant striking an anvil with a sledgehammer wrapped in cloth. A flash of light bloomed at the point of impact. When the smoke cleared, the Panther's glassy plate was not pierced. It was disfigured. A massive, bowl-shaped crater was punched into the steel, a full foot in diameter. The armor around it was spider-webbed with cracks. On the inside, a reverse shower of spall, jagged, red-hot fragments of steel, would have shredded any crew. It was a kill. An absolute, unequivocal kill. A collective, stunned gasp went through the crowd. This wasn't a lucky shot in the heat of battle. This was a controlled, repeatable, demonstrable fact. The laws of physics, as the U.S. Army understood them, had just been rewritten in a Belgian field. Colonel Reed walked slowly up to the Panther hull. He ran a gloved hand over the cratered steel, feeling the jagged edges. He looked back at the anti-tank gun, then at Arthur Kline. The boy was just standing there, hands in his pockets, watching. There was no triumph in his eyes. Only quiet validation. The colonel returned to the group, his face unreadable. He stopped in front of Hayes and Riggs. "This stays here," he said, his voice low but carrying to every ear in the sudden silence. "This does not go up the chain. Not yet. Higher command is bureaucratic. They'd bury it in committees until the war is over. They'd call it a field modification, an aberration. They might even court-martial the lot of you for destruction of government property or some other damn fool thing." He looked around at the assembled officers and men. "But we are not bureaucrats. We are in a fight for our lives. So here is what we are going to do. Captain Riggs, you will return to your company. You will identify your 3 most reliable, level-headed tank commanders. Lieutenant Hayes, you and your crew will become a mobile training team. You will visit each of them, one by one. You will demonstrate this technique. You will teach them. And you will swear them to secrecy. This is a battalion-level asset. Our secret. Our devil's cannon. He turned his granite gaze to Artie. "Private Kline. You have just been promoted to the battalion's unofficial, and most important, artillery consultant. Any questions?" Artie blinked. "No, sir." The colonel almost smiled. "Good. Now, get to work. We've got a war to win." As they walked back to their tank, the world had changed again. They were no longer just a crew. They were apostles. And they were about to spread a very dangerous gospel. The snow continued to fall, but now it felt different. It felt like a curtain being drawn, hiding their secret from the world, giving them the cover they needed to turn the tide, one backwards shell at a time. The weight of the secret was immense, but for the first time since the Bulge began, Lieutenant Hayes felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. A cold, hard, terrifying hope. The apostolate of the backwards shell began in the grim, practical twilight of a Belgian barn. Their first congregation was the crew of Bad Betty, a Sherman commanded by a grizzled staff sergeant named Donnelly, a man with a perpetual squint and the demeanor of a suspicious badger. He listened to Hayes's explanation with arms crossed, his gaze shifting from the earnest lieutenant to the quiet, unassuming kid they called backwards Kline. "You want me to tell my loader to intentionally load a shell wrong," Donnelly stated, his voice flat. "You want me to bet my life, and the lives of my men, on something that got a kid laughed out of Fort Knox?" "It works, Sergeant," Hayes said, his patience worn thin by fear and the burden of his secret mission. "We're not asking you to believe it. We're asking you to see it." They had brought a prize, the front plate from a wrecked Sturmgeschütz 3, propped against a stack of hay bales. Artie, without ceremony, took an AP round and loaded it into their tank's gun, the backwards motion making Donnelly's loader, a pimple-faced kid from Ohio, gasp. The gun roared in the confined space of the barn, the sound deafening. The hay bales behind the armor plate exploded into a cloud of chaff. When the dust settled, the steel plate was not pierced. It was blistered. A crater, deep and ugly, wept molten metal tears. The inside was a nightmare of jagged, backwards-facing shrapnel. Donnelly walked up to the plate. He didn't say a word for a full minute. He just stared at the damage, his badger's face unreadable. Then he turned to his loader. "You see that, Stevens?" "Yes, Sergeant." "You think you can do that? Backwards?" The kid, Stevens, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I think so, Sarge." "You damn well better." Donnelly turned back to Hayes and gave a curt, grim nod. "All right, Lieutenant. You've got yourselves a convert. It's ugly as sin, but it works." This was the pattern. The disbelief. The demonstration. The stunned, almost religious conversion. They visited Copperhead and Fury next. The crews were a mix of veterans, who saw it as just another dirty trick in a dirty war, and replacements, who viewed it with superstitious awe. Artie was the silent oracle at the center of it all. He didn't preach. He demonstrated. He would quietly correct a loader's grip, show them the exact motion, his hands calm and sure. He spoke in a simple, technical language about kinetic energy transfer and spall cones, a quiet professor of applied destruction. The legend of the Devil's Cannon began to seep into the battalion's bloodstream. It was never discussed on open radio frequencies, only in hushed tones during lulls in the fighting, or over a shared cigarette in a frozen dugout. It was their secret handshake, their hidden ace. And soon, it was tested in battle once more. A week after their mission began, the Germans launched a local counterattack to try and pinch off a salient the Americans had carved out. 3 Panzer IVs, supported by grenadiers, came rumbling down a narrow road towards the village held by Bad Betty and Copperhead. From a hidden position in a copse of trees, Donnelly watched them approach. "Stevens," he said, his voice calm. "You remember your lessons. AP. Backwards." Inside, Bad Betty, the loader, Stevens, his hands trembling only slightly, reached for the round. He ignored the instinct, the years of training screaming in his head, and loaded it the way backwards Kline had shown him. The breech slammed shut with a sound of finality. "Gun target, lead Panzer," Donnelly commanded. The gunner fired. The effect was instantaneous and horrifyingly familiar to Donnelly now. The Panzer IV's front plate, which should have been able to withstand a 75 mm hit from that range, simply disintegrated. A jet of flame shot out from every hatch. The tank slewed to a halt, blocking the road. The following German tanks, confused and suddenly vulnerable, tried to maneuver. From another position, Copperhead fired. Another backwards round. Another Panzer IV was transformed from a fearsome weapon of war into a blazing coffin in the space of a heartbeat. The 3rd Panzer, its commander realizing he was facing something he did not understand, threw his tank into reverse and retreated, crashing through a fence in its panic. The German infantry, their armor support gone, melted back into the woods. The engagement was over in minutes. 2 kills for 0 losses. A tactical victory born of a technical heresy. That night, in the cellar that served as the battalion's officer mess, Colonel Reed slid a tin cup of liberated wine towards Lieutenant Hayes. "Donnelly reported in," the colonel said, his voice low. "Says his loader performed the procedure under fire perfectly. Says it was textbook. He almost smiled at the absurdity of the word. "The road is secure. The salient holds." He took a sip of his own wine, his eyes distant. "You realize what this means, Hayes? This isn't a fluke. It's a tactic. A reproducible, trainable tactic. We've effectively given 3 of our tanks the punching power of a 90mm gun. Maybe more." Hayes nodded, the wine sitting heavy in his stomach. He thought of Miller's words from days before. "It's not clean." He had seen the inside of the Panther hull after the test fire. He knew what that shower of red-hot spall did to a human body. It was a brutal, messy way to die. There was no chivalry in it. No honor. Just physics applied with terrifying efficiency. "The men are talking, sir," Hayes said quietly. "They're calling it the Kline kick. Reed grunted. "Let them talk. Morale is a fragile thing. If they believe they have a magic bullet, that belief makes them fight harder. It makes them survive." He leaned forward. "But the Germans are not stupid. They will adapt. They've already given it a name. Their intelligence officers will be piecing it together. The surprise won't last forever." He was right. The secret began to develop a life of its own. A war correspondent, hearing the wild rumors from the frontline troops, tried to get a story, but was stonewalled by Colonel Reed's orders. The story was too incredible, too sensitive. Back at Army Group HQ, vague reports of unusually effective Sherman fire, in one particular battalion were filed away, attributed to lucky shots or poor German armor quality. But for Artie Kline, the weight was changing. He was no longer just the oddball loader. Men looked at him differently. There was a reverence in their eyes, but it was edged with fear. He was the keeper of the secret, the wizard who knew the forbidden words. He ate his rations alone, the silence around him a palpable barrier. The laughter that had once followed him was gone, replaced by a wary, heavy respect. One evening, as he was cleaning the gun tube, Miller approached him. The gunner had been avoiding him for days. "Kline," Miller said, his voice rough. Artie looked up. Miller shifted his weight, uncomfortable. I was wrong. Back in the forest. I thought you were going to get us killed." He gestured vaguely towards the world outside, the world where German panzers were burning. "Turns out, you were the only thing that could keep us alive." He didn't wait for a reply. He just turned and walked away. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even full acceptance. It was a truce, forged in the shared, terrifying understanding that they had crossed a line. They had looked into the abyss of total war, and instead of flinching, they had learned to speak its language. The metal was cold under his rag. He thought of the instructor at Fort Knox, the laughter in the classroom. He wasn't seeking vengeance or validation anymore. He was just a mechanic, and he had found a better way to make the machine work. The war had simplified everything, reducing morality and physics to a single, brutal question: does it work? In the frozen fields of the Ardennes, the answer, written in the cratered steel of dead panzers, was a resounding, and terrifying, yes. The secret was out, and it was killing its way towards a terrible, inevitable confrontation. The secret held for 10 days. 10 days in which the battalion, armed with its silent knowledge, became a black hole for German armor. Reports filtered up to regiment of astonishing local successes, of Shermans holding ground against superior forces, of a strange and persistent rumor about a new American weapon that turned tank armor to butter. The official line was aggressive patrolling and excellent gunnery. The truth was a quiet heresy, passed from loader to loader in the freezing dark, a ritual that began with the turning of a shell. But the Ardennes was a crucible, and no secret could survive its heat forever. The breaking point came near the town of Foy. German intelligence, piecing together scattered and incredulous reports from shattered panzer units, had deduced that the anomalous losses were concentrated in one American battalion. Their response was not subtle. They decided to erase it. Dawn broke to the sound of not one or two engines, but a symphony of them. A mixed Kampfgruppe of at least 10 panzers, a combination of Mark IVs, the dreaded Panthers, and one more lumbering King Tiger, emerged from the morning fog, supported by a company of panzer grenadiers. They came not with probing attacks, but with the grim finality of a hammer blow, aimed directly at the heart of Colonel Reed's positions. The radio net exploded into chaotic life. Kingfish actual, this is Bad Betty. Multiple contacts, grid 7-4-0-8-1. They're coming right at us. Copperhead reports at least 3 Panthers in the tree line. Fury is taking mortar fire. We're pinned. In his command post, Colonel Reed listened to the cacophony, his face a stone mask. He looked at the situation map, at the thick red arrows converging on his thinly spread companies. He keyed his microphone, his voice cutting through the panic, cold and clear. All Kingfish elements, this is actual. Execute Doctrine Kline. I repeat, execute Doctrine Kline. Good hunting. The code phrase, prearranged and never used until this moment, echoed in the ears of 3 tank commanders and their loaders. In Bad Betty, Sergeant Donnelly took a deep breath. You hear that, Stevens? It's showtime. No more secrets. The battlefield dissolved into a storm of noise and fire. German high-explosive shells tore up the earth around the American positions. Machine gun fire stitched the snow, and the American .30 cal and .50 cal guns answered in kind. But the central duel was one of armor and main guns. A Panther, its long gun flashing, scored a hit on Copperhead. The Sherman rocked on its suspension, but the shot glanced off the turret mantlet, a lucky bounce. Inside Copperhead, the loader, a man named O'Malley who had once been a butcher in Boston, didn't flinch. He grabbed an AP round, spun it, and rammed it home backwards. The gunner fired back. The shell struck the Panther's lower glacis. The effect was not as clean as the demonstrations, the angle was poor. But it was enough. The armor cracked like an eggshell, and a moment later, an internal explosion blew the Panther's turret askew. But the Germans kept coming. They were learning. They saw the flashes, saw the unique, cratering damage on their lead tanks. They began to focus their fire on the Shermans that were producing these anomalous results. Fury was the first to fall. A Panzer IV, firing from close range, put a round through its side before its loader could get a second backward shot off. The Sherman erupted, a fireball consuming it in seconds. There were no survivors. The loss sent a wave of despair through the net. The secret weapon was vulnerable. It could be killed. It was then that the King Tiger entered the fray. It was a monster, a moving fortress, its 88mm gun dominating the battlefield. It ignored the smaller tanks, its gun traversing towards Bad Betty, which had just claimed a second kill. Tiger. King Tiger. 100 yards, front. Donnelly yelled, his voice cracking. Inside Bad Betty, Stevens fumbled a shell. It clattered to the floor. The sheer psychological weight of the behemoth looming over them was paralyzing. Loader. Now, God damn it. Donnelly screamed. Artie Kline was not in Bad Betty. He was in his own tank, with Hayes and Miller, positioned a few hundred yards away, providing overwatch. They saw the King Tiger line up its shot on their comrades. They saw Bad Betty seemingly frozen in place. We can't punch through that thing's front plate, Miller whispered, despair in his voice. Not even your way, Kline. It's too thick. Hayes knew he was right. The King Tiger's frontal armor was over 180mm thick. A backward shell from a 75mm would just scratch the paint. Artie, however, was looking not at the Tiger's thickest armor, but at its one relative weakness. The commander's cupola. A complex, cast structure on top of the turret, it was weaker than the main homogeneous, his voice eerily calm. Aim for the cupola. The cupola? It's a tiny target. It'll ricochet. Not if we hit it right, Artie said. He was already loading. Backwards. The shock transfer, it might not kill it. But it'll rattle them. It'll blind them. By Donnelly time. It was a 1-in-a-million shot. A prayer. Miller, his hands slick with sweat, breathed out, trying to steady his heart. He aligned the crosshairs on the distant, small cupola. The King Tiger's gun flashed. The shell whistled past Bad Betty's hull, missing by inches. Fire. Hayes commanded. The gun roared. The backward shell streaked across the battlefield. It was a shot for the history books, a moment of pure, unadulterated skill and luck. It struck the King Tiger's cupola not dead on, but at a sharp angle. It didn't penetrate. But the kinetic energy transfer was immense. The cupola, a mass of steel and optics, was wrenched from its seat, shearing the bolts that held it down. It flew off the turret like a bottle cap, cartwheeling into the air. Inside the King Tiger, the world became a deafening, shattering hell. The blast effect, concentrated in the confined space of the turret, killed the commander and gunner instantly. The driver, blinded and disoriented, threw the tank into reverse. It crashed backwards into a pine tree and sat there, inert, a blinded giant. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath. The loss of the King Tiger broke the German assault. The remaining panzers, leaderless and spooked by the continued, inexplicable effectiveness of the American fire, began to withdraw. The battle was won. The battalion had held. But the cost had been immense. Fury was gone. Others were damaged. And the secret of Dr. Kline was now strewn across the battlefield for any observer to see. The cratered plates of the German tanks, the sheared-off cupola of the King Tiger, it was a forensic roadmap to their heresy. Later that day, a staff car from Regimental HQ, followed by a jeep with two stern-faced officers from the Inspector General's office, pulled into Colonel Reed's command post. The meeting was brief and tense. The IG officers had photographs. They had statements from observers. They knew. Colonel Reed, the lead officer, a full-bird colonel named Shaw, began, his voice icy. You are ordered to cease, immediately, all unauthorized modifications to standard ammunition and firing procedures. You will submit a full report on this. Technique. The men involved are to be relieved of duty pending an investigation for endangerment and destruction of government property. Colonel Reed stood tall. With all due respect, sir, that technique saved this battalion. It held this line. It is not your place to rewrite Army field manuals, Colonel. Shaw shot back. You have operated outside the chain of command, with a reckless disregard for procedure that borders on insubordination. It was then that a signalman rushed in, handing a slip of paper to Colonel Shaw. He read it, his face darkening. He looked up at Reed. It seems your little secret has a fan, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. General Patton's Forward Intelligence Unit just sent a query. They want to know about the field expedient anti-tank method being employed in our sector. It seems word reaches even old blood and guts. The room fell silent. Patton. The one general who prized results above all else, who loved nothing more than a clever, brutal solution to a battlefield problem. Colonel Shaw folded the paper. The wind had been taken from his sails. A court-martial of a successful battalion commander, now on the radar of George S. Patton, was a political minefield. The order to cease stands, Shaw said, though with less conviction. But the investigation is, on hold. Pending further review from higher command. They left. The immediate threat was gone. The next day, as the crews licked their wounds and buried their dead, Artie Kline was cleaning the bore of the gun, the same as always. He looked no different. He had not been hailed as a hero. There would be no medal for his discovery. His war was likely over. The secret was out, and the bureaucracy would now swallow it, study it, and perhaps, one day, incorporate it into a new manual for a future war. Lieutenant Hayes approached him. "They're sending you back," Hayes said quietly. "You, and me, and the crew. To a depot in France. They call it debriefing. Artie nodded, running the brush through the barrel. "You know what you did, Artie?" Hayes said, using his first name for the first time. "You changed things. Maybe not in the way we wanted. But you showed them that a kid from Boise, with an idea everyone laughed at, could stare down the might of the Panzerwaffe and win. They can't unsee that." Artie finally looked up. The sky was clearing, a pale, fragile blue after the weeks of snow and gray. "I just didn't want to burn, Lieutenant," he said softly. And in that simple statement, Hayes understood everything. This was never about revolutionizing warfare. It was about the most primal instinct, survival. It was about the cold fear of being trapped in a steel box, listening to the sound of an approaching king tiger, and finding a way, any way, to not burn. The snows of the Ardennes eventually melted. The war moved on, and the story of the backwards shell faded into the footnotes of history, an obscure anecdote overshadowed by larger battles and grander strategies. There was no official adoption of Artie Kline's technique. The war ended before the bureaucracy could catch up to his brutal ingenuity. But in the memories of the men who were there, in the silent fraternity of those who knew, the legend persisted. A legend not of a mighty general or a famous division, but of a quiet loader who, for a few, critical weeks, gave them a fighting chance against the steel titans of the Reich. He reminded them that in the face of overwhelming force, the human mind, unconventional, resilient, and desperate, remains the ultimate weapon. His story is a testament to the hidden innovators, the ones who break the rules not out of rebellion, but out of a simple, profound desire to see tomorrow. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories, comment where you're watching from, Texas, Germany, Australia. Thank you for keeping these memories alive.